Hello, hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to the Bay Area restaurant scene with a part 2 of our Spices 3 episode. For those unfamiliar, Spices 3 is a Bay Area local legend in downtown Oakland that sports a variety of both creative and traditionally classic Chinese and or Sichuan dishes. A few weeks back, we also took a shot at reproducing their stinky mapo tofu, which is a classic Sichuan tofu and ground pork stir fry, with one interesting addition in that it uses a fermented stinky or chou tofu in place of the more traditional soft tofu. After reproducing that dish, I thought it might also be interesting and informative to take a look at the more classic presentation of chou tofu, which actually is not typically used in a stir fry, but instead more commonly shallow fried and served with a dipping sauce. Now, at Spices 3, as well as most stateside restaurants, you'll often come across this dish as a shared plate, typically ordered with family-style meals. Outside of the States, though, you'll more often find them at Chinese and Taiwanese night market stalls, where you can order this dish on the go and eat it with kabob skewers, and no, I have no idea why you wouldn't just eat it with a fork. The dish, as the name implies, is quite stinky and pungent, coming from its 48-hour soak in fermented bean curd, and for what it's worth, definitely ranks pretty high on my list of one of the more adventurous things to try in Chinese cuisine, up there with chicken's feet and pig's blood popsicles. Please don't ask me to make those, I regret mentioning it already. Finally, we're gonna shallow fry these bad boys in a rounded bottom wok for a super crispy finish, and then serve them with a simple but classic oyster sauce glaze on the side. Okay, so let's get into it.
Every time that I try to write this song, every time I end up a little bit more lost. 'Cause all around I see chaos.
Okay, so kicking things off here first is my tofu, which is a firm tofu sliced into fairly large squares. Then I'm filling a medium-sized container with about 2 cups of water, ideally one that is both tall and narrow, so that we may submerge our tofu with less water. More on this in a second. But first up though, going in here first is 2 tablespoons each of Chinese baijiu or rice wine, and then 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar. Then next for the main event today is the stinky in our stinky tofu. This is our fermented bean curd. I like about 4 to 6 cubes here per batch. For those attempting this at home, this is by far going to be the trickiest item to track down, but if you have a Chinese grocery store in town, you'll find it near the canned goods because this stuff is pantry stable but also quite stinky. I'm using a fork or a whisk to break this stuff up until a smooth brine forms. Then I'm adding my tofu in. Here's my tall, narrow container coming into play. Then I'm covering it up and letting this ferment in the refrigerator overnight or up to 48 hours. Meanwhile, while our tofu gets to work on fermenting, I'm assembling my dipping sauce here, which will be served on the side and on top of our chou tofu today. First up, as with many of our Chinese dishes, this is 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by 1 inch or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger. These are gonna be the only fresh veggies in our stir fry today, which we're gonna bloom in our wok before reducing our sauce base for a nice aromatic quality. Then next up, moving on to our sauce, this is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and 1 tablespoon of sesame oil to start, followed by 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce for that iconic briny sweetness and umami. Then I'm rounding this out with a single tablespoon of Chinese fermented chili paste or doubanjiang for some heat and mixing this all to combine. Next, in a separate bowl is my cornstarch slurry. This is 1 tablespoon of cornstarch dissolved in water, which we're going to be using to thicken up our sauce reduction in a moment. Finally, last up, I'm removing my tofu from its fermentation 48 hours later, and then I'm pressing it dry. This, once again, should be quite stinky by now. Our goal here is to remove as much water from our tofu as possible before we start frying, because this is gonna allow the oil in our wok fry to expend its energy on crisping up the tofu rather than burning off moisture. Over on the stove, I've got my wok heating up, then I'm adding 1.5 cups of peanut oil to the wok, and as always, long out for that nice non-stick surface. Now, I know that this might seem like a lot of oil, but for a shallow fry, it's really not, because you want to consider if we were deep frying right now, this would take about 12 to 24 ounces of oil. Then next, I'm very carefully adding my tofu to the wok. If you've properly dried and pressed out the water from your tofu, then there really shouldn't be too much oil sputtering, but as with all shallow fries, exercise some caution at this point and probably use some tongs, Wesley. We're letting these go about 10 pieces at a time for 5 minutes per side, or basically until the tofu starts developing a nice browned and crisp quality on its edges, like so. Then I'm pulling these out at about 90% doneness. As always, remember to account for carryover cook in shallow fries like this. And finally, I'm repeating this with my remaining tofu. Mine took about 3 batches altogether, so be patient and don't overload your wok, or else the oil temperature will drop and your tofu won't crisp up properly. Next up, I'm removing my oil, then wiping down the wok, adding another 2 tablespoons of peanut oil, and doing 1 more long yao. Then I'm adding my garlic and ginger aromatics to the wok and blooming for about 20 seconds until fragrant. Next, I'm dropping in my sauce base here, plus about a 1/4 cup of water to loosen things up, and I'm letting this reduce for 2 to 3 minutes until those aromatics are nice and infused. Last up, I'm dropping in my cornstarch slurry here to thicken things up, and I'm removing our sauce from heat. Finally, back over on our cutting board, our tofu is waiting on drying racks and should have reached a wonderfully crisped up and stinky quality by now. Then I'm topping this all with my glaze, finishing with a pinch of sesame seed, and we're ready to eat. Alright, so I'll start off by mentioning that this is a dish that I actively used to avoid when I was a kid because of its pungent nature. I won't lie that this one is truly an acquired taste. I know my mom used to say that this stuff smells like dirty diapers, which is not untrue. That said though, there's still something about the smell of chou tofu that's just really nostalgic for me and reminds me of playing Pokemon on my Game Boy under the dinner table while my parents ate all of the dishes that I didn't want. Our tofu has a perfectly crisped up quality that honestly has me swearing by the shallow fry, and I may never deep fry anything ever again. That's a lie. I literally deep fried donuts yesterday. Anyway, the long ferment in that stinky bean curd gives our tofu a wonderfully aromatic and rich flavor that also makes me want to backtrack on every time that I've ever said that it's impossible to make tofu taste like anything, cause it is possible, it just takes a 48-hour ferment. Then our oyster sauce glaze on top is a rich but not overwhelming finish that just perfectly complements the crispy tofu as a glazed topping, dipping sauce, or both. Finally, I know we used a few ingredients here today that are going to be a little bit tough to track down, namely that fermented stinky bean curd. But if you are able to though, this is a fun and relatively easy one to take a shot at for a nice afternoon snack. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that we've been doing that's dedicated to reproducing dishes from the Bay Area restaurant scene. So definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet, because there's a lot of these. This one is also actually the second dish that we've done from Spices 3 because they're just that amazing. If you're local to the Oakland Bay Area, definitely check them out on 12th and Webster because they've got the best Sichuan food in town. Lastly, also if you are local in the Bay Area, the Woo Can Cook Fried Rice Pop-Up is kicking off the new year with a brand new pop-up location every Friday at Federation Brewing in downtown Oakland. So come by and say hi if you can. More about that at woocancook.com/eats. Finally, for those who have been watching for a while, make sure that you are also subscribed and hit the bell as well. Only about 30% of you all who are watching are actually subscribed, which if you're like me, there's a good chance you don't know is you. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice humans, and I'll see you soon. Bye.